yet.
We'll put the link in the email.
It's a
so send it
preview.
through, yeah.
Not fiction.
Music is homemade by Gemma.
Yeah, just sing it.
Yeah, so if you want theme song envy, you can start it now.
I've been standing on a rock and I've been waiting for the wind to blow. I've been standing on a rock and I've been waiting for the wind to blow. I've been standing on this rock and I've been waiting for my seed to grow. Gotta get back to the country, get on back to
Hi, I'm Gabby, and this is the first in a series of Transition Town Guildford's video series on home composting.
How cool is that?
Awesome.
Okay. So this is a session on how Transition Town values attract and engage people. There's a couple of us here that are involved in, got attracted to the Transition Town movement through concern about climate change. And peak oil and climate change are the two key things that really got going in the UK. And through the various climate things I'm involved in, I heard about this workshop called Common Cause on Values. And when I read the workshop description, I thought, oh wow, I just want to go do that. And when I got there, one of the things I walked away with was, wow, this explains why I love Transition Town so much and why it resonates with people. So I thought I would share a little bit of what I got out of that workshop with you, because it makes a difference in understanding and informing what I enjoy and what other people enjoy, and how to engage with people and have a conversation about what's important to us, whether we share things in common or not. So here's a quote from Sir Robert Worcester. Opinions are the ripples on the surface of the public's consciousness, shallow and easily changed. Attitudes are the currents below the surface, deeper and stronger. Values are the deep tides of the public mood, slow to change but powerful. So this little, the next few slides are a little bit about how values influence our attitudes and then influence the actions that we take and the opinions that we hold, and what the research has to say about what underpins them. So Common Cause, what's now known as Common Cause, originated from the World Wildlife Fund in the UK. So within the World Wildlife Fund in London, they realized, geez, they were really disconnected from their donors and supporters, and they were just really not, it just really wasn't happening in trying to engage members of parliament and people in positions of power on issues that were of concern to the World Wildlife Fund. And they thought, we're doing it wrong. We must be doing it wrong. There's got to be someone out there doing it right. So they dispatched Tom Compton and Richard Hawkins to go and have a look and see, what can you guys find that will give us new direction and get us back on track and being as effective as we want to be in the things that we care about, and really re-engage our supporter base. And what these guys found, they came across a body of research out of the United States on values. And when they first started looking at the research, they thought, wow, this is it, we're onto something. And eventually Richard went and founded and became involved with the public interest research, I forget what the C stands for. Center. That's it. And Tom remains at World Wildlife Fund, and together with a lot of other researchers and collaborators, they've published a whole series of incredibly useful resources that you can get from the Common Cause website that deal with things like how to engage like really conservative, extrinsically oriented audiences, values and caring for the environment, and so on and so on. So the slides that I have for you now are a taster on what underpins some of that research. These pictures are from that first workshop I got to go to in Melbourne, and that's Tom on the left and Richard on the right, Skyping from the UK in the middle of the night leading the workshop. It was the coolest thing. And where the name Common Cause comes from is, one of the things that the research shows is, you might be passionate about hunger, ending world hunger, supporting organizations like Oxfam. You might be passionate about biodiversity and conservation. You might be passionate about, say, women's issues and domestic violence. I might be passionate about climate change. But when we look at it, like personally and underpinning those campaigns are values we share in common. So our common cause is calling forth those values in the community and having people have a look at what it is about the issues that we individually, collectively care about, what we have in common, and the values that underpin them. That's where the name Common Cause comes from. So values help us work out how we can broaden and deepen and engage the public on things that are much bigger than our individual self-interest. How do you get people out of that rat race of not having enough time, kids have to go here, job, work, money and all that stuff, and get them interested in and engaged in some of those bigger things that we're facing now. So Common Cause offers us something on how values work, why they matter in the way we talk to people and the way we promote our events and the way we put our events together and the way we talk to people. A little bit about how values develop and how they change. And I think you'll find that really will resonate with your own experience of your own values over the course of your life so far. And how, if we ground our work in our transition town groups in common values, that really helps forward what we care about individually and as a group. And a little bit about what that offers us in effectively engaging people in groups like ours and the things that we think are important. So what are values? Well, they function as guiding principles. They underpin the actions that we take, and they flow through the situations that we find ourselves in and guide some of our thinking and our attitudes and views. And you could say they're like standards that we use internally, subconsciously, when we make decisions about things and form opinions. And it's quite subconscious. So this is a way you might depict it. Values sit at the core, and they inform the goals and aspirations we have as individuals, and they certainly influence our attitudes and then the actions and the behaviors that we engage in. And I'll show you a little bit more about how that works here. So this is looks like a scatter plot of sort of 50 odd fundamental, universal human values. So these are descriptors of values that are based on quite a large body of research, tens of thousands of people from around the world, all different cultures, all different walks of life. These are fundamentally, universally human. And the research shows that we share them all. They just exist in different proportions. So you might be passionate about social justice, for example. You might be passionate about, let me see, what have we got there? Honoring of elders and tradition. You might be someone who loves exciting outdoors, daring sorts of things. You might be someone who's interested in social recognition and social power. So these are all different ways of describing certain values, and we all have them all. Now, I invite you to have a look at this random scattered depiction of values, and just take a moment to pick one or two that you think, oh, yeah, that's one of mine. So just take a moment and look at the fine print. Sorry about the small print. Feel free to come forward. In fact, if you come to the quadrant here, because they're probably mostly largely compatible with transition town type of values. When people engage in those type of values, it pulls away from those on the opposite end of the spectrum. And that's quite heartening. So you don't get born one way and stay that way. It's dynamic. If I look at the sort of concerns I had when I was in my 30s, they're very different from the interests and concerns I have now. And the values that I hold dear now are quite different from the ones I had then. So I know from my own experience they change. And there's a lot of research going on right now looking at what sorts of things are catalytic for people and activate intrinsic values. For example, being in nature is one of them. Australian Conservation Foundation is funding a PhD student at the University of Adelaide. And one of the things half of his PhD actually is about studying the transition movement. But one of his projects that was funded by ACF was he took executives on a journey in the Kimberley along Aboriginal song lines. So they spent 9 days with Aboriginal elders going along the song lines, living in their communities and everything. And so what he did was he interviewed them extensively first on what their values are now, and then he interviewed them afterwards on what they had to say then, and then he followed them up over the course of his PhD to see what happened, not just for them personally, but then how that played out in their jobs as chief executives and senior managers and things like that. How cool is that? And who here reckons they have an idea how that story might end out? Yeah. So there's things we intuitively know about from our own experience of how that works. And a lot of the work is looking at what sort of things can we do. A little example, from my own, is I did the Earth Cares course, and I started saving the little aluminum tabs off the cans. So I've got the pot on my counter where they go, and you don't have to start saving too many tabs before you're thinking, I gotta stop buying these cans. So that's a really small example of a catalytic experience that activates a train of thought that alters your behavior. That's grounded in a value that gets activated. And that's exactly how transition towns work. So it's not a communication strategy, but it certainly can very effectively underpin a communication strategy, whether it's one-on-one or whether it's actually a whole campaign. And it changes the way you look at things. Now here's another way of depicting the pieces of the pie. And researchers would call those on the lower left-hand end here representing extrinsically oriented or motivated values and intrinsic values. Schwartz, I think, called them self-enhancing values on this end and self-transcendent values. So one of the really pull your head out of your butt lines of thinking that I got out of this was, so you know when I said, we all have all the values, well, I look at them and think, oh, well, I don't have much of that one. But how I put it to myself now is, you could say my values are the same as a human being, like as Tony had it. The difference is, mine are strongly activated in some areas where his are not, and that's it. So it's not like mine are good and his are bad. They're just different. And actually, they're universally, fundamentally human. And there's a strong evolutionary basis for extrinsic values. So Tim Kasser, I'll show you a short video from him shortly. He's one of his books is The High Price of Materialism. And materialism in terms of consumer shopping type materialism is reflected on the extrinsic end of the spectrum. And I relate to materialism like it's bad. And the detrimental side of it. But actually, if you're thinking caveman evolutionary, hanging on to things and collecting and gathering stuff has strong survival component to it. So understanding what underpins some of them takes the charge away from, well, they're doing this and we're trying to do that and it's not working and us and them and all that. It's fundamentally universally human, and I find it empowering and freeing to focus on the values I hold dear and what it is that I can say and do that invites people to consider or engage in a conversation about, you know, what are their values and what do they care about, and learning something together, and being compassionate toward, like having compassion for how you end up getting stuck on different corners of the spectrum. So values are universal and they interact. So that's push me, pull you thing. So we know those executives that Chris took to the Kimberley have an entirely different experience of life now, having walked the path with elders up in some of the most pristine wilderness in Australia. And that will now play out in their lives and in their families in a way that's really exciting. We know that people come to a composting workshop with Kim, and next thing you know, not only have they got worms and everything, then they're getting chickens, and then they're growing vegetables, and then I'm sure we've all in our groups had someone come to one workshop, and next thing you know, they're on the steering committee, and then they want to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a great example of a value getting activated in a really productive way. Now I forgot why I put that one up. So the other way in which values interact is what a psychologist would call spillover, and it comes back to why Tom Compton and why they called it common cause. So under universalism, self-direction, and benevolence, if we successfully activate a value, so for example, you'll see in benevolence there a spiritual life. You know, there's people we know for whom spirituality is a really strong interest. So once you know that that's like a companion value that's right alongside something that, say, I might hold dear, which could be something like unity with nature or protecting the environment. I might be speaking to someone who doesn't particularly have a strong relationship to environmental things, but once I establish that, you know, they're a really spiritual person, or for example, nearby respect for tradition there, or honoring elders, they're sufficiently close to each other on the spectrum that there's spillover. That's where and how we can find common ground when we're talking about values. A great example came from Sarah, one of the community organizers from the Wilderness Society here. One of her jobs was to go to Southern Cross, and they have, of course, they want them to leave, you know, it's a mining community now, right? It used to be a farming community, it's now a mining community. A lot of people there come from elsewhere to make big bucks digging it out of the ground. And of course, the Wilderness Society is interested in having them leave it in the ground. Well, she used her training in a values-based approach, finding common interests with people in the community. And what they said to her was like, look, I'm hearing you, dear, but this is my job. This is our livelihood here. But at the end of the day, they got 100% of people they spoke to take some action that they invited them to take, which included signing a petition, donating money, joining the campaign, agreeing to be on a stall. They had a whole suite of actions that they offered people. And she achieved that by finding common ground, having values-based conversations. So one of the things that's exciting about that is if my friends at Oxfam have a really effective campaign about world hunger, that has a spillover effect in a campaign that the Conservation Council might have on marine reserves or something like that. We're carving out and holding the space for that spectrum of values that relate to ones that we share. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that's why people love the kind of events that we organize. Yep.
Just a horrible thought came to my head.
What's that?
Is this also used, like this values approaches and spillover effect, is this also used by marketers and advertisers to get us to consume more? Because then we're selling our values to us in a different way.
Yeah,
so
totally.
it's working counter to what we're
Totally. And I'm going to show you a clip from Tim Kasser in a moment that talks about materialism. But here's the golden nugget under like the sickening feeling you could easily have about the power of marketing and advertising, is when you start reading the research about the influence of that sort of thing, you think, geez, does having a campaign to save the Numbat or something, like, is that even going to get heard against the background of like the 3,000 consumer, materialist, extrinsic messages that people get every day? And the answer to that is yes. That's why organizations like the Wilderness Society, Oxfam, Greenpeace are well respected and trusted organizations, because they're speaking a truth that resonates with people from the intrinsic end of the spectrum. And that those lone voices do get heard against the backdrop of all that marketing and advertising. And what Common Cause is about is having environmental groups, social justice organizations, campaigners enhance their effectiveness in campaigning from that end of the value spectrum, so it's a stronger voice. Because it's catalytic and it pulls. Does that answer your question? Peter, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I don't know if you can go back to the circumplex. I just wanted to give another example which really stood out to me in terms of, as a group, if we're going to pitch an event, and it's also a pitch an action that's about climate change, and if the only message we give, or the predominant message we give, is you should do this because it saves you money, which is a lot of what NGOs and groups debate, have a look at what values that's reinforcing and where that ends us up. So it's not that we can't say it's going to save you money, but if that's our predominant message, all we're doing is reinforcing the opposite of what we're trying to achieve ultimately. So we might win that small battle, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot for the bigger picture.
And how that plays out, for example, is when you talk about sort of saving money and reducing your power bills, that does sell solar panels. But those people who buy solar panels and solar hot water based on that kind of a campaign, it's no surprise then why they then turn around and they're still not recycling properly, and they're not doing this and they're not doing that. You may have read about research that shows, solar panels, it doesn't actually get people. Well, it's related to the marketing and what underpins it. Yeah. You were going to say something, Colin?
I was just going to say, I know some quite conservative people that have solar panels, and they talk about them all the time, and it's totally about, my electricity bill was $0 this week. So if you talk, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But it's still serving the purpose.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be engaged on values. So it is engaging them in doing the right thing, even if it's for the wrong reason. I think that's valid. I think that's still a valid option. If we couldn't engage them under values, well, find another way to engage them.
Yeah. And so that's a very active area of debate. And it's very interesting to hear what Tim Kasser has to say about that. Zanita?
I was just
I'll come back to you.
I was just going to add to that, and with the Solar Cities initiative, there was lots of funding for that, and one of the things that they did is they basically created this household where they basically used very little electricity, but then when they got solar panels, they're like, we don't have to reduce our energy use anymore, and then they just started using lots of electricity, and it comes back to what your values are and trying to connect them. And I also hate the solar panel ads that talk about turning on your air conditioning when you're using your air conditioner. Anyway, that's just like
Yeah. Well, you've illustrated a really great point, because once you start thinking about the values and the next level, which is like framing things in a certain way, you start seeing it embedded everywhere, and it starts becoming glaringly obvious campaigns that are pitched that are pitched really off. John, you had a comment.
Tim, you mentioned Tim's name. What was
Tim
his surname?
Kasser, Kasser. I'll show you a video clip from him shortly.
And just one thing on advertising values. Check out Adbusters, anybody.
Yeah.
They're the people who began the Occupy movement. And they're the best, some of the best advertising executives in the world, and they use advertising against advertising, so it's really useful.
Yeah. Yeah. So the traditional advertisers and marketers, they say, and Tim Kasser is really passionate about that. They say, look, you know, you want to market to extrinsically motivated people, you ought to use extrinsic messages. It's the only thing that works. So they just keep doing it and keep doing it. And you know, if you have an ad, you know, you show an ad for some sort of cosmetic or something, and you start having people feel insecure about, you know, their looks or how they're fitting in or whether people are going to like them, that just makes you buy stuff. That's what spillover looks like on this other end of the spectrum. That's why you see all this stuff about terrorism and security. Because the minute you start making people feel fearful and insecure, they buy stuff. They do. It's very clear that's how the psychology of it works. It would make a difference if we had, and Tim Kasser has some really brilliant recommendations for what we might have done. For example, in the aftermath of 9/11.
Yes.
Because what we did was go on a spending spree and ended up with a global financial crisis. So he's got some really interesting recommendations about what we might say, and a great example of how it went well was the cafe incident in, it was Melbourne, wasn't it? Sydney. There was a great community response to that was very positively based in values. Yeah, and I just thought, oh, you know, how cool is that? So you can see it happening, and when you look at the machinery of what does happen and what can happen, you can set out to repair the damage using values in a way that produce a much more constructive outcome. So now somebody else had their hand up? Yeah, Graham?
Probably a question for the group as much as anything. Just on that extrinsic and intrinsic value. And I can speak, I guess, a little bit from my own experience, and I wanted to see if this resonates. If I've experienced something in that sort of intrinsic value space, I find that it's harder to then go back into the extrinsic value activity.
Yeah.
So if I'm buying something or participating because it achieves or appeals to a higher value or a different value, an intrinsic value, my sense is that I will gravitate there more easily or more readily than back into extrinsic value. And I wanted to know if that was true, if that resonated, because if it was true.
Yeah, that's would be my experience. Who does that resonate? Yeah, that's that intuitive side of
Yeah, okay. So if it is possible to sell solar panels but attach an understanding or an education, if you like, around the intrinsic value nature of what that is and could be, that it will stick a lot more.
Yeah. An interesting high-level way that plays out is if you look at the Scandinavian countries. On my way to that first workshop in 2011 or 2012, what it was, there was a news item that week about means testing, I think it was maternity leave. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, you know, people making $200 grand a year, they don't need maternity leave, you know, publicly paid or whatever it was. So you could get my thinking, right? And they gave an example of that in the workshop, and they said, oh, well, actually, in the Scandinavian countries, it's universal, because as a community, they value that a child, and it's a year, it's a year, 18 months in the UK, they had a survey of 700 or 800 people, and they identified the 30th most extrinsically motivated people in the sample group. So these are the really conservative, show me the money, make me famous, hedonistic, total power-hungry types, right? In the extreme, out of this broad cross-section of people. And they brought them in for a study, and one half of them were primed, intrinsically primed. It's not my field to go into how they do that, but they do it with language in a way that's unconnected to, say, like environmental anything, right? So it's just a priming, it's a subconscious priming thing that's the design intent of the study. So 30 highly extrinsically motivated people, half of them intrinsically primed on the way into the study, the other half extrinsically primed. And they brought them into the first room and they said, okay, this first exercise is a creative little warm-up thing. We want you to design a logo for car sharing. And that's it. Didn't say anything about car sharing. They didn't say greenhouse gas reduction, environmentally friendly, anything. That's all they said. Draw us a little logo for car sharing. And then I gave them 10, 15 minutes to do that. And they said, okay, kids, we're done this part. Now we're going to go next door for the next thing. Just take a piece of paper and stick it in the wastebasket and weigh it. We'll see you next door. And guess what happened? 70% of the intrinsically primed, highly naturally extrinsic people chucked their piece of paper in the recycling bin. And 70% of the extrinsically primed, already extrinsic people just chucked it in the regular wastebasket. No need to do statistics to see a very highly significant effect. And there's study after study after study that illustrates that effect of priming. And I give you that one simple example to illustrate the power of conversations and the language. Like you and I can subversively prime people intrinsically every time we open our mouths, just as a possibility. Taster, yeah, and that's why I put on this session.